Imagine coming home from a simple grocery run on a Friday night. You set your bags down on the dining room table. You have no idea that someone is already inside your apartment. And you have no idea that you have less than a few minutes left to live. That is exactly what happened to a 19-year-old newlywed in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on December 5, 1975. Her name was Lindy Sue Biechler. And for nearly 47 years, her killer walked free, going about his daily life, getting married, raising children, growing old, while her family never got a single answer. Not one. But here is what makes this story absolutely extraordinary. The man who took her life was eventually caught, not because he slipped up, not because someone finally came forward after decades of silence, but because of a coffee cup. A coffee cup that he casually tossed into a trash can at Philadelphia International Airport in 2022. And that one piece of discarded trash unraveled 47 years of secrets. This is the full story of Lindy Sue Biechler, who she was, what happened to her on that horrific December night, the exhausting decades-long search for justice, and how cutting-edge science finally brought her killer to his knees in a courtroom almost half a century later. Before we get into it, if you are new here, welcome to Crime Reporting CR. We cover real, in-depth crime stories that matter. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. This community is built for people who believe that every victim deserves to be remembered and every killer deserves to be found. Now let's get into it. To truly understand the weight of this case, you have to know who Lindy Sue Biechler was. Because she was not just a name in a case file. She was a real person, young, full of life, just getting started. Lindy Sue was 19 years old in December of 1975. She was married to a man named Philip Biechler, who everyone called Phil. The two of them were newlyweds, still in that early hopeful chapter of life where everything feels wide open and full of possibility. They lived together in a 4-unit apartment building at Spring Manor, an apartment complex on Closs Drive in Manor Township, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Lindy worked at a floral shop. She was young, employed, married, and living in a quiet residential area. By every account, she was exactly the kind of person who had absolutely nothing to fear on a Friday evening. She had no known enemies. She was not involved in anything dangerous. She was just a teenager navigating the beginning of her adult life in small Pennsylvania community. That is what makes what happened to her so gut-wrenching. It was not something she could have seen coming. It was not something she deserved in any shape or form. She was 19 years old, newly married, and she went out to buy groceries. She never came back. It was a Friday evening, December 5, 1975. Lindy Sue had gone out to do something completely ordinary, grocery shopping. When she returned to her apartment at Spring Manor on Closs Drive, she brought the bags inside and set them on the dining room table. That detail was confirmed later by investigators. The groceries were still there when her body was found. She never even had the chance to put them away. Somewhere between approximately 6:45 in the evening and 9 o'clock that night, everything went wrong. Based on what investigators later pieced together, a man broke into her apartment and attacked her. What followed was not quick. It was not clean. Lindy Sue Biechler fought back. The evidence in that apartment made it absolutely clear she did not go down without a struggle. There were signs of a violent confrontation throughout the apartment, blood on the outside of the front door, blood on the wall in the entryway, and patches of blood across the carpet inside. She was stabbed 19 times. 19. In her neck, her chest, her upper abdomen, and her back. Prosecutors later revealed that her attacker used 2 different knives, first a small 4-inch bladed knife, and then a butcher knife that he grabbed from Lindy's own kitchen. He also sexually assaulted her. When police and investigators eventually arrived, they found her lying on her back on the floor of her apartment. A knife was still sticking out of the left side of her neck. The wooden handle of the knife had been wrapped in a tea towel, almost as if the killer was being careful not to leave fingerprints on the handle. A male footprint was also discovered in the kitchen. Her aunt and uncle were the ones who found her. They arrived at the apartment at approximately 8:46 in the evening, and what they walked into that night is something no family member should ever have to experience. One of the first officers on the scene reportedly said he had been to World War II and had never seen that much blood. Let that sink in for a second. An autopsy confirmed that Lindy Sue Biechler's cause of death was massive bleeding from multiple stab wounds. She had been sexually assaulted. Her killer had left behind physical evidence, including blood and semen. And then, just like that, he vanished back into the community, back into everyday life. Manor Township police responded and opened what would become one of the longest-running homicide investigations in Lancaster County history. In the days and weeks that followed, investigators worked the case hard. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed every lead they could find. They canvassed the Spring Manor apartment complex and the surrounding neighborhood. They looked at residents, former residents, people who knew Lindy, people who did not know her at all. They examined everyone who might have had access to that building on the night of December 5th. But nothing came together. No arrests were made. The case went cold. In the early 1980s, investigators briefly looked at a man named Gerald Stano, a convicted serial killer from Florida, to see if he could be connected to Lindy's murder. By January of 1983, police had all but ruled him out. Around the same time, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office actually paid $2,000 to bring in a pair of California-based psychics, yes, psychics, to evaluate the case back in 1981 or 82. The psychics reportedly believed the killer had a tattoo, dark hair, dark eyes, and olive skin. Investigators looked into a man named Mark Capilupo, who had been charged with sexual assaults in Lancaster County in 1975 and was later shot and killed by a guard during a prison escape. But nothing concrete ever materialized. Decades rolled by. The case file sat in storage. Officers who had worked it retired. Some of them passed away. But the case was never officially closed, and the evidence was never thrown out. That decision to preserve the evidence would turn out to be one of the most consequential choices in the entire history of this case. Then came the 1990s, and with it, an entirely new tool that law enforcement had never had before: DNA analysis. By 1997, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office submitted evidence from the Biechler crime scene for DNA testing. What they were working with was a sample recovered from the right side area of Lindy's underwear, which had been preserved in the evidence room for over 2 decades. Testing confirmed it contained semen from an unidentified male. A DNA profile was successfully extracted. Now they had something real. For the first time in over 20 years, investigators had a biological fingerprint belonging to the man who killed Lindy Sue Biechler. In the year 2000, that DNA profile was submitted to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which is the national law enforcement DNA database containing profiles of individuals convicted of certain crimes. Investigators waited and waited. No match ever came. The reason was simple. The killer had apparently never been convicted of a crime that would have put his DNA into the system. He had never been arrested for anything serious enough to generate a CODIS entry. He was a ghost, at least as far as law enforcement databases were concerned. And so the case went cold again, now with DNA in hand, but nowhere to go. Fast forward to January of 2019. The Lancaster County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit took formal possession of the Biechler homicide investigation. This was a significant development. The Cold Case Unit brought fresh eyes, new resources, and crucially, knowledge of emerging forensic technologies that had not existed when Lindy was killed or even when the DNA was first extracted in the 90s. Investigators began collaborating with Parabon NanoLabs, a Virginia-based forensic DNA company that had been making waves in law enforcement for its groundbreaking approach to genetic genealogy. Now at this point, most people had heard about genetic genealogy after the 2018 arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. That case shocked the world because investigators used DNA from old crime scenes to trace the suspect's family tree through a public genealogy database, ultimately identifying DeAngelo after he had evaded law enforcement for over 40 years. The Biechler case would now follow a similar path, but with an even more complicated twist that would push genetic genealogy to its absolute limits. The name CeCe may not be familiar to everyone watching, but in the world of forensic science and cold case investigation, she is genuinely one of the most important figures of the last decade. CeCe is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon NanoLabs. She has been a pioneer in the field since the early 2000s, originally focusing her work on non-criminal cases, helping adoptees find their biological families, and identifying unknown remains. But over the years, she and others in the field recognized that the same techniques could be applied to solving violent crimes. In 2020, Parabon NanoLabs brought more onto the Biechler case. And right away, she knew this was going to be one of the hardest cases she had ever worked. Here is how genetic genealogy works in plain language. Investigators take the unknown DNA profile from the crime scene and upload it to a genealogy database. In this case, GEDmatch, which is a platform where people voluntarily submit their DNA results for genealogical purposes. The system then looks for potential relatives of the unknown suspect, not the suspect himself, but people who share enough genetic material to indicate a family connection. From there, the genealogist works to build out a family tree, progressively narrowing down candidates based on age, location, gender, and other factors until a likely suspect emerges. In most cases, Moore said, she hopes to find at least a second cousin match that gives her enough of a foothold to start building a meaningful family tree. In the Biechler case, she got almost nothing. The DNA hits in the database were extremely distant, far more distant than what she typically worked with. We are talking about extremely remote cousins, not the second or third cousins that would normally anchor her research. The leads were, in her own words, very disappointing. But CeCe Moore did not give up. She made a decision to develop what she described as a novel, non-traditional approach, something she had never done before. And that decision is what cracked the case wide open. When the standard database approach did not produce usable leads, CeCe Moore went back to the raw genetic data and looked at it differently. She began analyzing the migration patterns embedded in the DNA, the genetic signals that tell researchers not just who a person might be related to, but where their ancestors came from. What she found was striking. There was, in her words, a very clear migration pattern from a small town in the southern part of Italy, a place called Gasparina, located in the region of Calabria. Gasparina is a tiny hilltop village, the kind of place most Americans have never heard of. But a very specific group of people with roots in Gasparina had migrated to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, over the course of the early 20th century. Moore began scouring historical Lancaster County records, century-old membership cards, immigration documents, community organization rosters. She found a local club of Lancaster County residents who had come from Italy, and those membership cards listed names, birth years, and family connections. She estimated that around 2,300 people with Italian genetic ties were living in Lancaster County around the time of Lindy's killing. But when she filtered by the right age, the right gender, and the right family ancestry, specifically those connected to Gasparina, the number narrowed dramatically. There were very few people living in Lancaster who were the right age, the right gender, and had the right family tree. She said, one of those people was a man named David Vincent Sinopoli. According to investigators, Sinopoli had never once come up as a suspect during the original investigation or in any of the follow-up work over the decades. Not a single tip, not a single witness, not a single lead had ever pointed to him. As Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams would later say at a press conference, Sinopoli was not on their radar, and no tips over the years had ever suggested him as a possible suspect. But CeCe Moore's research had quietly, methodically led investigators straight to his door. When investigators began looking into David Sinopoli, what they discovered made the case even more chilling. Sinopoli had actually lived in the same 4-unit apartment building as Lindy Sue Biechler the year before the murder. He had been her neighbor. The same building, the same hallways. He knew the layout of those apartments. By December of 1975, he had moved to a different unit within the Spring Manor complex, but he was still in the area. He knew exactly where Lindy lived. He had access to that community. And yet somehow, for 47 years, not one piece of information, not one witness, not one tip had ever pointed investigators in his direction. He had lived his life in Lancaster County largely undisturbed. Court records would later reveal that after the murder, Sinopoli went on to get married, a marriage that lasted 36 years. He had children. He had a daughter and 2 sons from a previous relationship. He went about his life as an ordinary member of the community. Meanwhile, Lindy Sue Biechler had been dead since age 19. Her husband, Phil, had to carry the weight of losing his young wife to an unsolved murder for nearly 5 decades. Her family had no answers for 47 years. All of that time, her killer was right there in Lancaster County. Having a person of interest was not enough. Investigators needed hard evidence. They needed Sinopoli's DNA to compare against the crime scene sample that had been sitting in a lab for decades. But they could not exactly walk up to him and ask for a DNA swab. They had to be smart about it, so they surveilled him. For months, investigators quietly monitored Sinopoli. They watched, they waited, and on February 11, 2022, their patience paid off. David Sinopoli was traveling through Philadelphia International Airport. At some point during his trip, he finished a cup of coffee and casually tossed it into a trash can. He walked away without a second thought. Investigators retrieved that cup. The DNA extracted from the saliva on that discarded coffee cup was then sent to a laboratory for comparison. The results came back in June of 2022. The DNA on the coffee cup matched the DNA found in Lindy Sue Biechler's underwear, the sample that had been preserved since 1975. The match statistic was staggering, approximately 10 trillion to 1. 10 trillion. To make the case even stronger, investigators went back to the original crime scene evidence and tested blood that had been found on Lindy's pantyhose. That blood, different from a semen sample, also came back as consistent with David Sinopoli's DNA. They had him. On July 17, 2022, law enforcement officers arrived at David Sinopoli's home on the 300 block of Faulkner Drive in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was 68 years old. He was placed under arrest and charged with criminal homicide in connection with the murder of Lindy Sue Biechler, a crime he had committed 46 years earlier when he was in his early 20s. Sinopoli was taken to Lancaster County Prison without bail. The following day, on July 18th, Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams held a press conference at the Lancaster County Courthouse. Standing alongside Manor Township Police and CeCe Moore of Parabon NanoLabs, she announced the arrest to the public and to the world. Lancaster County's oldest cold case homicide had finally produced a suspect. In her statement, District Attorney Adams said there has been a never-ending pursuit of justice in this case that has led us to identifying and arresting Sinopoli. Law enforcement never forgot about Lindy Sue, and this arrest marks the first step to obtaining justice for her and holding her killer responsible. CeCe Moore, speaking at the same press conference, described the case as one of the most difficult she had ever worked. She noted that the Biechler case was actually the first time she had used the novel, non-traditional approach of tracing Italian ancestry patterns to narrow down suspects, and she has since used that same method successfully in other cases. For the Biechler family, who had waited 47 years for this moment, the arrest was the beginning of something they had almost given up hoping for: justice. After his arrest in July of 2022, Sinopoli was held in Lancaster County Prison without bail. He initially pleaded not guilty to the charges, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. 10 trillion to 1 is not a number you argue against in a courtroom. On October 19, 2023, nearly 48 years after he killed Lindy Sue Biechler and 15 months after his arrest, David Vincent Sinopoli stood before Lancaster County President Judge David L. Ashworth and entered a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, a second-degree felony count of aggravated assault, and a third-degree felony count of burglary. Before sentencing, Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson, who had prosecuted the case, made a statement that cut through the silence of the courtroom. She pointed directly to a photograph of Lindy Sue Biechler that had been placed next to the defendant, and she said to Sinopoli, "These cases are never forgotten. Lindy Sue will never be forgotten." While the defendant was able to carry on with his life, Lindy was extinguished by him. Look at her, and the precious life he stole in 1975. Sinopoli, according to the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office, glanced at the photo without any visible reaction. Phil Biechler, Lindy's husband, the young man who had lost his 19-year-old wife nearly 5 decades earlier, was also given the chance to speak. He addressed Sinopoli directly and said, "David Sinopoli, you took a huge part of my life for me and caused an extraordinary amount of pain and suffering for so many people. While others had to live their life with the terrible consequences of the murder you committed, you got to live your life out." Judge Ashworth then spoke. He looked at Sinopoli and said, "The enormity of the damage you have caused is incomprehensible. The depravity of your actions cannot be overstated." David Sinopoli was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. He was also ordered to pay over $25,000 in court costs to cover the DNA laboratory expenses. His only statement to the court: "I would like to apologize to everyone, including my wife." Nearly 5 decades of waiting, and that was it. Before we get to the final thoughts on this case, let's take a moment to talk about the technology that made all of this possible. Because if you do not fully understand what CeCe Moore and Parabon NanoLabs did here, you cannot fully appreciate how remarkable this outcome was. For most of history, DNA in criminal investigations only worked if you had something to compare it against. You collected DNA from a crime scene, you ran it against Cody's, and either you got a hit or you did not. If the suspect had never been in the system, had never been convicted of a qualifying offense, you were out of luck. That is why so many cold cases remained cold for so long, even after DNA evidence was collected. Investigative genetic genealogy changed all of that. Instead of comparing crime scene DNA directly to a database of convicted criminals, genetic genealogy compares it to a database of ordinary people who have voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry or family research purposes, platforms like GMatch or Family Tree DNA. These people are not criminals. They are everyday folks who wanted to find out where their great-grandparents came from, or whether they have relatives they never knew about. But when their DNA is in a database, it can flag a partial match to a crime scene sample, meaning the investigator now knows that the unknown suspect is biologically related to someone who submitted their DNA voluntarily. Even a distant cousin match gives a trained genealogist a starting point. From there, the genealogist builds out a family tree. They use birth records, census documents, immigration files, old club membership cards, church records, newspaper archives, any historical document they can get their hands on. The goal is to progressively narrow down the candidates until they land on someone who fits all the criteria: right age, right gender, right geographic location, right family connections. In the Biechler case, CeCe Moore had almost no close relatives to work with. The database hits were so distant that she had to invent a new approach, tracing the specific migration pattern of Italian families from a village of Gasparina to Lancaster County over the course of the 20th century. That kind of deeply localized historical research is not something most investigators would even know how to attempt. But Moore did, and it led her straight to David Sinopoli. The Biechler case was not just a victory for one family. It was a proof of concept that investigative genetic genealogy can crack even the most stubborn cold cases, even ones with minimal DNA database leads and decades of silence. There is something profound about this story that goes beyond just the facts of the crime and the science that solved it. Think about what it took to get justice for Lindy Sue Biechler. It took hundreds of interviews across multiple decades. It took an evidence room that preserved biological material for over 40 years. It took the emergence of DNA science in the 1990s. It took the invention of investigative genetic genealogy. It took a cold case unit reopening the file in 2019. It took Parabon, NanoLabs, and CeCe Moore developing a brand new investigative approach that had never been tried before. It took months of surveillance. It took a man carelessly throwing away a coffee cup at an airport. Every single one of those pieces had to fall into place. If even one of them had been missing, if that evidence had been discarded, if the DA's office had never reached out to Parabon, if Sinopoli had carried that coffee to go, the outcome could have been completely different. For Phil Biechler, Lindy's husband, the nearly 5 decades of unanswered questions are almost unimaginable. He was a young man when he lost his wife. He grew old carrying that grief and that uncertainty. When he finally stood in that courtroom in October of 2023 and addressed the man who had killed Lindy, he said something that says everything. While others had to live their life with the terrible consequences of the murder you committed, you got to live your life out. That contrast is devastating. David Sinopoli got to live. He got married, raised children, had grandchildren for all we know, and walked through the world as a free man for nearly 50 years. Lindy Sue Biechler was 19. She had just started her life. There is no way to fully close that gap. No sentence can undo nearly 5 decades of pain. But the fact that justice eventually came, that science and persistence together finally cornered a man who thought he had gotten away with the worst thing a human being can do to another, that matters. It matters for the Biechler family. And it matters for every family still waiting for answers in their own cold cases. Because if this case teaches us anything, it is this: the evidence does not forget. The DNA does not forget. And as long as investigators refuse to give up, time is not always on the killer's side. And that is the full story of Lindy Sue Biechler, a 19-year-old newlywed from Manor Township, Pennsylvania, whose murder went unsolved for nearly half a century, and whose killer was ultimately undone by a cup of coffee and the relentless pursuit of the truth. If this video moved you, if you think this story deserves to be heard, share it. Every share helps this channel reach more people, and every view helps us keep telling the stories of victims who deserve not to be forgotten. Subscribe to Crime Reporting CR if you are not already part of this community. We cover real, deeply researched cold cases and true crime stories, every single one told with the respect and seriousness that the victims deserve. Hit the like button, drop a comment below telling us what you think about the use of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. It's a technology that is changing everything, and we want to hear your thoughts. Rest in peace, Lindy Sue Biechler. You were not forgotten. And justice, even if it took far too long, finally came for you. We will see you in the next one.